What you see here is a scene with two lights. One light is the Skydome, Arnold Skydome, and one is a tiny little light which reflects here. It's a point light. It sits just below this part of the surface here. We have an odd looking object. Let's render this from another perspective. Like this. So it's really complex. And look at this little nose here, for example. Look at this rim here. As I said before in other tutorials about NURBS modeling, this is the key tool for automotive industrial design. So that's the way you make fenders, car surfaces, the chassis. Even the engines are constructed using NURBS modeling techniques. Of course, you might need polygons from time to time, but the polygon world is totally different because the smooth surfaces is the domain of the NURBS world. So let's create some geometry in the empty scene. For example, a polygon plane, which we can scale up to a high dimension, so we have a surface. We don't need to see the grid anymore. We right mouse click on the surface, assign new material, Arnold standard surface shader, and we reduce the specular weight to a very low value so it doesn't reflect very much. We go to the checkerboard icon here and we choose a bulge texture, which we see when we click here. So we need a light now, the Skydome light, which sits here, and if we render it, this is what we get. Quite nice. Since we don't want to pick the inadvertently the light, let's uncheck it here. All lights won't be visible here, but they're still in the scene. So the next thing is we'll create a NURBS sphere, and the NURBS sphere, of course, is under curves surfaces here. The blue icons are all NURBS surfaces. You also have them under surfaces, and actually you cannot create them here. You need to create them in this menu here. NURBS primitive sphere would be just what we need. This is the same command as clicking on this icon here. So this is the sphere we have. We press the key F in order to get close to the object, and the key W to get the translate arrows, and we right mouse click it to get a new material. And the material is going to be an Arnold shader again, the standard surface shader, and we give it another color like bluish tone, and that's basically our starting point. Now when we render it, of course, this is what we have. We'll make it a little bit bigger, and then we duplicate it by Control D. So we have the same sphere here. We apply a new material again. You don't have to do that material application all the time, but it's actually quite nice, and we're dealing with aesthetics here. I use a preset in this case. You don't see this, it's blood, and I blend it by 75%, so I get a little bit of blood node here. And but it looks just better when you have nice textures, and it's all about aesthetics anyway. And I move the bulge grid a little bit to the side so it doesn't look that symmetrical here. So it's kind of, I can rotate it a little bit like this, so that's better. Yeah, let me scale this sphere up, and this sphere I scale this way. Now we have two spheres intersecting each other. In the polygon world, you could easily use the Boolean operations, which are not available for NURBS surfaces. That has to do with the topology of the NURBS surfaces. You cannot just cut pieces of a NURBS surface away. I think I covered this in a previous tutorial. If so, there's a link in the description below. Basically, it's the NURBS surfaces make such nice curves, whereas the polygons are very robust in terms of deleting and adding little details here. For example, in this section here, this sort of triangle, if I needed more geometry here, I couldn't do it. Because the NURBS surface demands that when I change the resolution of this triangle, I have to change the resolution of the whole thing. Whereas in the polygon world, this would be just easy. Okay, I pick both spheres. This one isn't a sphere anymore. And now I go to surfaces, which you find when you're under the modeling menu set, surface. And there's a command called intersect. You may use the option box, you don't need to. The default settings are like this. You create curves on both surfaces, cutting curves, so to say. And the curve type will be a curve on a surface, and not an independent curve in the 3D world. It will have it will be restrained to the surface and have the coordinates of the surface and not of the 3D world. I think that's the better pronunciation. We apply this thing and close the window. So what we see now is nothing changed really, but we have two curves here which are highlighted in sort of white. And what they do is they show us the intersection part of the two objects here. Now, when you, if you want to get rid of a part, you have to do what is called a trim. That's typical to the NURBS world again. So let's pick this surface, for example, and then we go to Surfaces and the Trim tool. And we just invoke the Trim tool and then we check what we are supposed to do, because you cannot fantasize about this. You need to know the exact procedure. By the way, below the Trim tool is the Untrim tool. So you can untrim any NURBS surface at any time, because the NURBS surface actually cannot be trimmed. It just pretends to be trimmed. So when you untrim it, you basically restore the optical look of the original surface. Too complicated? Never mind. Trim tool. You see there's something happening here. This looks dangerous, I know. You can navigate in the scene all right. Here you see the intersection curve, and here is the other intersection curve. Right here, this one. This white thing here is the seam where the NURBS surface sort of starts. This doesn't matter for us now. Down here in the message or whatever status line, I see Trim tool. Click button 1, which is the left mouse button, on the surface to select the region to keep. Okay, we want to keep this region. So I have this little orange icon here, and the status line tells us we can keep other regions as well. Let's keep this one. So now only the middle one is has the little dots in the lines. The ones here have straight lines, and the status line tells us press enter to trim the surface. That's what I'm doing now. I'm pressing enter, and nothing has changed, has it? Well, you'll see in a second, because this sphere, we can hide it by Control H. And then we see that we actually cut the two NURBS surfaces. So we have the remaining one now here. If we render it, this looks beautiful, and this is possible to do in the Polygon world as well, but let's get to a more delicate and more sophisticated way to do this cutting process, because it leads to wonderful outcomes. Chapter 2, we delete the two surfaces here in the outliner. We could also create a new scene, but I want to keep the light and the ground plane. Now let's go to the, well, side window and create a NURBS curve. I usually pick this icon. You can pick this icon as well. This creates an arc. This combines and cuts curves, etc. But the basic curve tools are the two here. So I pick this one, and then I create, well, I create something out of my fantasy. I don't know if it looks cool, but normally the NURBS surfaces which you create from curves from scratch always look good. Press enter, so that's the curve I just created. I'll create another one in a minute. So the curve sits on that plane now, and now I use a revolve operation. This is this icon here. I could also go to surfaces and revolve. That's the same thing. So, sorry. So let's revolve this surface. This is what I get. And I think I still have the previous shaders here, so I assign an existing material, which is the standard surface in blue. When I render this, it has this quite nice look. So let me move it to the side. The curve here stays the same. It stays at the same place. And if I click right mouse button and the control vertices, the little dots here, and I move the ones here, so you see the my main surface moves as well. So I can make it thinner here, for example. See, this is all dependent on this curve. When I delete the curve, the history is gone, so I cannot go back to the curve in order to change things here. Actually, I would like to have a little bit more dent down here, so I think I use this menu here. This is not good because this comes from the inside and penetrates the outside. That's not what I want. This makes the whole bottom more wide. Yeah, this is better. And I move this inside and this inside, like so. Whatever, you can play with these things here. Now I go back to object mode, right mouse button, and I delete the curve, and the surface is still here. Now let's go to the side window and create another curve. 2, 3, 4, 5 points. I press the key G in order to repeat the last command, and key G again, so I have 3 curves now. I go to the perspective view here, and when I press the key F8, I get into component mode, and here I can change the position in, oh, sorry, I want to pick this, F8. And move little dots in different directions. We always get beautiful surfaces when we move these things. So 3 interesting curves, you see. And well, let's go back to object mode. Now I need to pick them in a certain sequence. The one below, the lower one is this one, plus shift click the middle one, plus shift click the top one, and then I go here. This creates a loft, which is basically building a tent from one curve to the next, to the next, to the next. So this is the tent we have, and we right mouse click and use the existing material, which is this reddish sort of shader. When we render it, it looks all very fine. Soft shadows, and keep in mind Arnold has only one light in the scene. It's a Skydome light, which makes a diffuse shading of everything with shiny parts here, because we have a reflective shader here, and this odd object. The objects don't really make sense, and I'm not a fan of tutorials about how to create something like a sword or whatever. Lots of tutorials, I do respect them, but I mean, this is I like fantasy objects, and of course you can always create realistic things later on. If I pick the curve number 1, which is the lower one, see what happens to the red surface. It goes like this. When I scale this curve to sort of 0, I get a flat, more or less flat curve in this axis and in this axis. So whatever I want to apply, this has implications on the surface, so I delete the curves now when we lose the history, of course, and have 2 surfaces. Now I move this surface into that surface. Now scale it a little bit up, and I rotate it like this. So what can I do now with a cutting process? This is a very smooth, elegant surface, this one as well. So I select both of them, and I go to surfaces and intersect. I intersect them. So now I already see there are curves on the surfaces here. This white outline sort of thing. You can see them from the back as well. They are the curves which will keep our objects intact or cut them in 2. So what do we want to do? I mean, that's up to you really. I think I'll pick this surface and go to Surfaces, Trim, the Trim tool, and the Trim tool asks me again, click on the surface on the part of the surface which you want to keep. I want to keep this part of the surface, and I press Enter. And now when I hide this surface, this is what I get. Couldn't be better, could it? Now render it. Arnold respects the cut. Actually, the whole red surface is still intact. It's still there, but we don't see it. We can untrim it, of course, and or just undo the command. I go to Surfaces, and I go to the Trim tool. And that's what Maya suggests me to do. Which area do I want to keep? And I think I want to keep this area here, and I press Enter. Now when I hide this surface, that's what the cut did. It cut this piece out, and it left that little dot here. So it's an interesting surface really. We can put a light into it, create lights, point light. Now where is the point light? Usually in the center of the scene. I don't see it because I deselected the light option here. So here's the point light, and I move it into that box. Press the key F in order to see where it sits. I think it sits there quite all right. Here it is. And this, of course, is a surface which you cannot achieve with other means, really. It's this surface to do in polygons would be really complicated. Of course, you can do other things with it, like let me get carried away a little bit. Could use this object here, scale it up a little bit like this. And since I don't want to keep it, I just do another cut, which is called a trim in the NURBS world. So I select these two surfaces, surface, intersect. Now I select this surface because that's the surface I want to keep. Surfaces, trim tool. I want to keep this part and maybe the inside part as well. And then I click enter or punch in enter. And when I hide this sphere now, I get this cut. So I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. The aesthetics of NURBS surfaces is just unbeatable. And when you cut and trim them, you get really interesting objects. And of course, you can create realistically looking objects for real purposes, like swords if you want to, with this technique. I don't.